Good afternoon, everyone. This is Wendy Noss at COSSA, and welcome to today's COSSA Headlines web chat. So if you're new to COSSA Headlines, let me just give you a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today. Headlines is a relatively new activity for COSSA, and it's really meant to set up a way to have two-way conversation between COSSA and its members, you. And so what we do once a month is we go over the top headlines, whether they're policy or funding or something else, really boil down the information of what you need to know when you need to know it, recognizing that we're all busy and don't always have time to consume all of the information that is in front of us. And so we want to have this opportunity to check in with our memberships and let you know what we're thinking about and things that we think are important to you. Also, though, each month we spend the bulk of the time on what we call deep dives. And this month, we're very fortunate to have with us a special guest who's going to talk with us about evidence-based policymaking. So I hope you'll stick around both to hear this month's headlines, but also for the deep dive topic as well. And then, of course, we like to end each web chat every month with some homework in the event you want to stay engaged in either the deep dive topics or some other policy issues. We know that some members really do get involved in advocacy and policy, and so we want to make sure our community has the tools that it needs to be active should you want to be, and I hope you will. Today's experts are shown on the screen, and we include our email addresses as well. The idea here with Headlines is really not to spend too much of your valuable time on yet another webinar, but instead to give you the resources you need should you wish to follow up. So you'll see a lot of links to other documents on the pages and email addresses so that you can follow up on the things that interest you. And I will mention that we do share the slides afterwards, and we do record the webinars, and we post them on YouTube and on the web and share them with all of you and the rest of our membership the day after we record. So tomorrow, watch for an email should you miss any of the links as we go through the slides today. Just as a quick refresher, you are on today's COSSA Headlines webinar because you are affiliated with one of our membership organizations. And so that either means you are a member of or you work for one of our governing associations, which are shown here, or you are affiliated, involved with one of our other membership organizations, including colleges and universities. If you see an organization or a college or university not on our list, but you think they would benefit from these discussions, please do share our information with them. And when the video becomes available, you could share the recording as well so they can see what membership can get them and that they can engage in headlines in coming months. There is a chat function, and so for quick questions throughout, especially on the headlines portion, we encourage you to use the chat box, and we will monitor those questions as they come in.
Hey, sorry, really quick, I am having trouble connecting to the web link.
Okay, who is this?
Taylor Scott.
Okay, if you could send an email to my email address, which is shown right here on the screen, wnoss@cossa.org. One of our staff members will email you and try to get you set up.
I have Julia Milton's email, so I can reply to that. I can't
Perfect.
see the screen at all.
Oh, right.
Okay, good.
Julia will get you set up. Thank you. Okay, so let's turn to this month's headlines. And again, we'll go through these fairly quickly, but if you have questions on any particular topic, you can ask once we're done here, or all of the links are on the screen where you can find more information. And of course, you can email any one of us at any time, and we're here at your disposal. Okay, so congressional headlines. I think the main topic on everybody's mind at this point is what's happening with fiscal year 19. And of course, if you've turned on the TV or the radio or your computer, you know that we are bumping up against another potential partial government shutdown. But all signs indicate right now that we hope the president will sign the omnibus agreement to fund the rest of the government that's currently under a continuing resolution through the end of this fiscal year before the deadline hits tomorrow. Hot off the press news, though, is that we now know what the numbers are in that legislation and how agencies that haven't been funded yet, such as the National Science Foundation or the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Justice or Commerce, we know how they will be funded in this final piece of 2019 legislation should the president sign it tomorrow. If you go to the link on the screen, which is basically the COSSA website, and go to our funding updates page, you'll find a chart that includes the new numbers that are in the legislation. And the story overall is good. Increased about 4% increased funding for the National Science Foundation, flat or increasing in some cases funding for some of the research and statistical arms in the Department of Agriculture, the Census Bureau getting much needed resources, and a less than positive story for the research entities within the Department of Justice, unfortunately. But we will provide all of the context and additional information to our membership in the coming days. As we do our final analysis, we will write it up into a comprehensive report and send that to our members tomorrow or early next week. So stay tuned for that for all of the details. But what it really means is that now action will turn in earnest to fiscal year 20. So stay tuned for that. In other congressional news, we have been reporting over the last several weeks that about the new committee leadership in the House and in the Senate. Of course, a lot of change happening in the House with the change of party, but a lot of leadership change for the committees that we care about in the Senate as well. And so hopefully you are following our biweekly newsletter and seeing our reporting on who our new leaders are that we will be depending on and working on over the year ahead. But there's a link on your page, essentially going to the COSSA website and clicking on the Washington Update tab, and there you will find our reporting on committee membership. Turning to executive branch news, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development has had a draft strategic plan on the streets for about 2 months now, or a month, and they are looking for public input into that strategic plan. The deadline is tomorrow, and we've been reporting on it in our newsletter. And so if your organization or if you are planning to write comments on the strategic plan, a reminder that those comments are due tomorrow, but also that COSSA is developing a statement as well to make sure that there is appropriate emphasis at this institute within the NIH on behavioral and social sciences research, which is currently largely missing from the draft strategic plan. So we will share our comments with the broader community so you can see what we're doing on your behalf once we submit those comments tomorrow. Over at NSF, you may have seen we've sent a member message out, which is a letter from the head of the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate, really encouraging the community to look at NSF's big ideas for future investment. This is a major investment area for the agency. They are investing in new big research questions that are purposefully multi and interdisciplinary as a way to really move science forward. And on their surface, they don't necessarily seem like questions that fit with behavioral and social and economic science research. But the letter from the SBE Assistant Director, Dr. Lupia, really aims to urge our community to take a solid look at these solicitations because he sees lots of room for social and behavioral science in these funding opportunities. And many of them have deadlines coming up relatively soon. So the letter is now available on the NSF website, but it's also available on our website too. And I would encourage you to take a look at the big ideas and at Dr. Lupia's letter and get in touch with him or with us if you have any questions. Going back to NIH for a moment, the agency is also seeking public input on an updated definition of behavioral and social sciences research. They're using a crowdsourcing platform on the web to allow people to respond to a draft definition that they have made. And there's a little more time to respond to this request. Comments are sought through next week, and COSSA will be commenting, but encourage the community as well as they try to tighten up behavioral and social science research as it relates to health research at the NIH. That's, I think, an important distinction, that they're not defining behavioral and social science research for the entire set of disciplines. So stay tuned for COSSA's comments, but go back to our website or our newsletter for more information on how you can be involved in that activity. I mentioned a little bit earlier that the fiscal year 2020 process will now begin in earnest, hopefully, once the 19 bills have been finally enacted. Usually the annual appropriations process starts with the official release of the president's budget requests. But given the longer than 1 month long partial government shutdown, the president's budget request has been delayed as well. So we are hearing that the president's budget request for next year will begin to roll out the week of March 11th, with additional details coming out the following week of March 18th. And COSSA does an agency by agency, program by program analysis of the budget request. So watch for that in mid-March. But it's also important to note that given the delayed process, Congress is not waiting for the budget request to come out to start their work. They are starting to organize, schedule hearings with agency leaders, and will begin writing their legislation sooner rather than later. So the 2020 process will start moving quickly, but as we learned from 19, it may not end quickly. So follow our coverage online, make sure you're staying on top of what the budgets will mean for social behavioral science research over the next several months. And of course, I wanted to flag for everyone, we include in our newsletter, but also maintain on our website a page dedicated to funding opportunities. And the link is there on the screen. It's not a list of every funding opportunity relevant to our community, but we do highlight new and noteworthy opportunities that come up and flag them for you, such as the big ideas at the National Science Foundation. So check that out. Turning to community news, many of you have probably seen the press release that Rush Holt, the current CEO of AAAS, has announced that he will retire sometime later this year. Rush has been with AAAS for about 4 years now, since 2015. Before that, he spent a long time in the United States Congress, and even though he comes from a physical sciences background, he has been a great champion for social and behavioral science research. So this is a real loss for our community and for science advocacy and policy across the board, but we do wish him well. A launch of a search is starting soon if it hasn't already, and so keep an eye out for that, and hopefully we will have equally strong leadership at AAAS by the end of this year. Finally, 2 bits of COSSA news. If you're on this webinar, you are getting our emails, and so you've probably seen that we have Social Science Advocacy Day coming up, and that early bird registration ends tomorrow. So I would encourage everybody to sign up. We are aiming for 100 advocates this year, which is quite a bit of growth for us. But I think we can do it. We are still a couple of months away, and we are about halfway to our goal. So I encourage you to join us and to bring a friend along as well. Check out the website and certainly email us if you have any questions. Finally, our latest Why Social Science blog came out recently. Again, these are monthly pieces, oftentimes from guest contributors outside of our immediate COSSA community. And this month we were featuring evidence-based policymaking, which is incredibly timely with today's deep dive topic. So I invite you to go to whysocialscience.com for additional information on evidence-based policymaking and to hear about why social science is important relative to that important topic. Again, hopefully you are receiving our COSSA Washington update where we pull many of these headlines, and you can get much more information on each of the topics there. COSSA Washington update is free and open to the public. You do not have to be a member like you do for these webinars. So I would encourage you to share those widely and encourage your colleagues to sign up as well to stay abreast of all of the policy impacts for our community. I am going to pause here for just a moment. If there are any questions and you know how to unmute your line, you can do so now, or you can chat in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box during the deep dive as well, and certainly can address your questions about the headlines later. This is not your only opportunity. So I will stop talking for just 1 second. Okay, seeing none coming through immediately, I don't want to waste anyone's time and turn to our special guest who's with us today. We are very fortunate to have Nick Hart. He's the Director of the Evidence Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and really the person who has been actively pushing for this legislation that he will go over to be enacted, and I think just as importantly, keeping our community informed of those actions and what they mean for our community. And so he has generously agreed to come and talk us through all of these activities, and then talk at the end about what our community can do and what this means for COSSA. So I will pass the presentation over to Nick.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation to join today, and thanks to all of you who are listening in. I think probably one of the most important things that I can say here at the outset is that I think this is a really incredibly exciting time for those of us that are interested in social science research or applying data analytics to learn how to improve government policies and programs. And there's a really exciting set of signals that we've recently received from Congress and the executive branch that are going to lead us down a pretty productive path going forward. So I just want to spend a few minutes giving some kind of 30,000 foot view of the landscape, tell you about what's really got me excited in the new legislation, and then some of the implications for what that all means going forward. So there's a new law called the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, and it was passed by Congress in the final days of the 115th Congress, so right at the end of December, and then signed by President Trump back in mid-January. And inside the law, there are provisions that really have incredibly positive and productive strategies and requirements around how we manage our data inside government and how we make information available to those who are both inside and in some cases outside as researchers who want to access that information. There's a lot of work to be done here. So I think this group is well aware, just because a new law is enacted does not mean that we start to see immediate changes. There's a lot of implementation work that will inevitably require your attention and that of a broader community. And so I'm just going to say here at the outset that I hope you all stay engaged as the work goes forward, because we have quite possibly months and years of activities now to make all of this a success. So the title of the talk is around evidence-based policymaking, and I always like to do a little bit of a level set, since there are a lot of different conceptions of what the phrase means. And so I just want to describe how I think about what the topic means. And this is hopefully not going to be jarring to those of you in this community. And I also don't want to imply that government doesn't do this today. I think one of the common reactions when people walk in the room and say, I'm here to talk about evidence-based policymaking and we're going to start doing it, my parents would say, well, what do we do now? I mean, why aren't we doing this today? Realistically, there are a lot of really great examples of where government agencies and decision makers are using high quality information to guide their decisions or inform their decisions. But I use the terminology, that's really what we're talking about, is trying to make sure that decision makers, policymakers have access to the best information possible so that they can make good decisions. It's not necessarily a statement that says any form of research or study is necessarily going to dictate what the decision is. And we know there are a lot of really important and valuable other aspects of how we make decisions, value systems, we have democratically elected leaders and things of that sort that are always going to play an important role in determining what policies are. But to the extent that the research and statistics and evaluation can have an important seat at the table and a high profile seat at the table, our hope is that that information is going to be increasingly used to really guide the strategies going forward. So in that spirit, back in 2016, there was a commission that had been created out of a piece of legislation that went through Congress. And it was a group called the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. COSSA has followed the work for quite a long time, so many of you are probably familiar with this. Essentially, this is a commission that was the brainchild of then House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan and Senate Budget Chairwoman Patty Murray. Back in 2013, we were in the midst of another government shutdown at the time. And, they both realized that they had some important questions that they wanted answers to and believed that fundamentally we could answer some of those questions based on data that government already collects. And that there were a whole host of reasons that limited their ability to get good answers to those questions. So they made a commitment to try to figure out a strategy for doing better, for improving access and accessibility to government data, but also ensuring that we're respecting privacy and confidentiality protocols. And so that was really the charge that had been given by Congress to the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking back in 2016. There were 15 politically appointed members. It included Republicans and Democrats. We had 5 privacy experts. Catherine Abraham, a former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, was the chair, and Ron Haskins from the Brookings Institution was the co-chair. And together, the commissioners had a really phenomenal background and set of expertise around some of the issues that the commission was charged with tackling. Some of them had been, former program administrators. Some had led agencies. Some were part of the statistical part of government and statistical agencies. Others from the evaluation community or the economics universe. And so when you took all of those folks together, it offered a really incredible set of expertise that framed how the recommendations ultimately came about. When the commission put out its final report on September 7th of 2017, there were 22 recommendations, and they were unanimous. I think that's a really cool signal for where we are in the state of the conversation about this, because it is rare that these types of commissions come out with unanimous recommendations. And this is such an important topic that it was great to see the unanimity, but it also signaled immediately that we weren't going to see these really stark Republican or Democratic divides on the issues that were moving forward. And I'll talk more about how that played into the legislation in just a moment. So the 22 recommendations that came out of the commission really fell along the 3 themes that are on the screen now. Not surprising, based on the charge the commission was given by Speaker Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray, they spent a lot of time talking about how we improve access to government data, recognizing that a lot of data are collected just through the course of running programs. We call it administrative records. And that sometimes we need to link those data to other data sets, potentially things collected by statistical agencies like the Census Bureau. And we face a lot of barriers in terms of either accessing or enabling the linkages of those data. And some of them are legal constraints, some of them are potentially bureaucratic constraints, and in some cases those constraints are unintentional. So the commission made some recommendations about how to make improvements in that area. To the extent that the Commission talked about improving access to data, including confidential records about people or businesses, they also recognized that having strong privacy protections was going to be a really important part of ensuring people could continue to trust the data and the analysis that was coming out of these kinds of research, but also ensuring that we were ethically approaching good uses of the information consistent with the consent or accountability or transparency mechanisms that were in place at the time of the data collection. And the third set of themes was all about capacity. So even if we enable access to existing data, we have strong privacy protections in place, basically we need people, resources, and processes to align to actually enable us to analyze data and recognize their utility. So when the Commission put out its set of recommendations, there was really no guarantee that action would be taken by Congress or by the executive branch. I think we probably all have examples of commissions that have put out reports and the reports sit on a shelf somewhere and collect dust. And to give a lot of credit to the commissioners and the folks at Congress, I think there was a really clear expectation that action was going to be taken. And that was in fact part of the reason why we launched our work at the Bipartisan Policy Center back in 2017. So the Commission puts out its report on September 7th. On September 11th, we launched the project at BPC. So it was really hitting the ground running as a way of ensuring that someone in some entity was going to be present to continue the conversation about advancing the recommendations after the Commission shut down. So as a governmental entity, the Commission was time limited. It wasn't ever set up to exist in perpetuity. And we recognize that. So really our work at the Bipartisan Policy Center over the last year and a half has been focused on trying to find good and reasonable implementation strategies for those recommendations. So that is where the Evidence Act comes in. It's called the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. I'm going to call it the Evidence Act for short, just to not use a long title every time we reference it. This is a piece of legislation that was filed as a direct consequence of the Commission issuing its unanimous recommendations. It was, perhaps not surprisingly, co-sponsored primarily by Speaker Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray, who'd also been the champions of the Commission itself. It is a piece of legislation that was intended to be a foundational starting point for addressing some of the challenges that the Commission acknowledged and also some of their explicit recommendations. But it was not intended to be the end point. We know there are many more recommendations and provisions that will need potentially more legislative direction or other legislative language going forward. And so the name of this legislation is actually yet another good signal that Congress is really interested in continuing to advance this discussion about how we better use data for research purposes going forward. So I want to just highlight some of the key features of what's in the legislation, which is now law. And this will hopefully help articulate why I'm so excited about this. So the law is broken into three core titles. The first title is really all about capacity. And this is addressing some of the really explicit things that the Commission recommended. One idea out of the Commission was that agencies should develop what are called learning agendas. Think about it as a strategic plan for research and evaluation as a way of signaling what priorities we have around data collection, but also important questions that policymakers want answers to for new regulations or potentially reauthorizing a piece of legislation. We know they have questions, and we also know that we can't always answer those questions. But if we can honestly recognize what we want to know answers to, then we can begin to tackle some of those questions in a really thoughtful and intentional way. So the goal here is to send signals from government to those in other parts of government, but also outside in the academic community or the nonprofit world to try to find strategies to address these big questions. Just as an example, after the Commission put out its report, the Small Business Administration actually developed a new learning agenda. And when they put it out, it had exactly what we wanted. They listed out some of the big questions that they had. And shortly after they made it publicly available, researchers started calling SBA to ask for access to their data so they could actually start to answer some of those questions. So that's really the goal here, is to try to find a way to enable some of that basic communication about the needs for evidence and also the strategies for ultimately generating it. One other area of capacity that the Commission recognized is often a gap in federal agencies today is the lack of a formal evaluation enterprise. So while some agencies have a really strong culture of conducting program evaluations, impact evaluations, looking back at whether programs and policies are achieving their goals, it is not standardized or even necessarily the norm across a lot of federal agencies to do that. So the Commission said, first and foremost in that space, that having a clear and identified leader would go a long ways for ensuring that someone recognizes in every agency that it's their job to have conversations about generating evaluations, but then also using the results of those evaluations in policy decisions. So the Evidence Act includes a provision for agencies to develop or to assign rather an evaluation officer. And coming out of that, we'll also have some workforce implications, the development of policies to support evaluation, and then annual plans to just clearly articulate what evaluations are underway. Then one other area that I'll just mention briefly in the capacity front is something that's related to what I would call the headline recommendation that came out of the Evidence Commission. There was a suggestion that the Commission had made around the creation of something called the National Secure Data Service. The idea here was to have a place where we could conduct data linkages across highly confidential data sets in a temporary and incredibly safe way, where we could constantly monitor re-identification risks, but also deploy some of the most advanced privacy-preserving technologies that are available today. The legislation that I'm describing, the Evidence Act, does not create the National Secure Data Service, and I want to be very clear about that. There's nothing here that actually creates the data service. But what Congress did is they included a provision that establishes a new advisory committee that's all about planning for the ultimate implementation of that data service. And what that tells us is that Congress is really interested in having this conversation about a more privacy protective way to do data linkages and monitor some of the risks of re-identification that we see. But we're not quite there. We know there's going to be a lot of important and in some cases tricky conversations to be had about data access and data privacy issues that this group is really going to help us plan for. Title II of the bill is all about open government data. And for those of you that may have heard of something called the Open Government Data Act, that's what this is. It's included here in full as part of the Evidence Act. And this does a couple of really key things that also come out of the Evidence Commission's recommendations. One, it's going to require agencies to increasingly make data that are non-sensitive publicly accessible and machine readable to the extent possible. So this is not something about confidential records. It's not something about confidential business information. Things that have some level of confidentiality or sensitivity associated with them, it's not really what this piece is talking about. But to the extent agencies are, they have data that are not sensitive, or maybe performance information, or information about client services at an aggregate level, the goal here is to try to make that kind of information more readily accessible so that we can use it as an accountability and transparency mechanism for government. This title also includes some really, I think they're really cool things. One is this idea of establishing what's called a data inventory. So the federal government has tried this before somewhat unsuccessfully. We know that across government today, we have a really hard time of telling you what data actually exists, what data government currently collects. So if you're a researcher interested in accessing government data about a given issue, you may not even know what the universe of data available are. And of course, there are plenty of places that have gone to great efforts and links to make researcher access a priority, but that's not always the case, particularly when we're talking about data that are collected by programs just through the course of normal operations, the administrative records. So the requirement here is that agencies are going to have to take a serious look at what data they're collecting and make some information publicly accessible about those data. So this doesn't necessarily mean everything will be available, particularly in the short term, but what it does mean is that we'll have a better accounting of what government's collecting. So if you're a researcher and are interested in accessing some kind of data around a particular issue, you can at least know what the starting point is. And the second thing that I think is really exciting here is this idea of what's called a chief data officer. So this is an idea that's not necessarily new. A lot of corporations have CDOs. Some federal agencies have them today. But this is also a recognition from Congress that we really need people across the federal government that are planning for making data useful at the point it's being collected. So the goal of having a chief data officer as a senior leadership position in every federal agency is that it's really somebody's day job to say, how are we going to use this data? What do we need to make it more useful? And let's plan for all of that at the outset. So they are going to be really an important role in ensuring the open data requirements are met, the data inventories are adequately implemented, and that we're being good stewards of all forms of data moving forward in terms of the federal government's activities. All right, Title III. This is, for those that are familiar with statistical agencies, one of the most important privacy laws we have on the books in the federal government, and has a lot of really important implications for statistical data. It's called the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act, and Congress just reauthorized it. So we have this really clear, strong statement that says that these privacy protections around confidential data are incredibly important and incredibly valuable. Congress didn't just reauthorize this part of the law, though. They actually expanded the authorities. And there are some really great and strong provisions that were included specifically as out of the Evidence Commission recommendations. One that I'm really excited about that is a pretty nerdy one is something called Statistical Policy Directive Number 1. Many of you may be familiar with a piece of guidance that came out of the White House's Office of Management and Budget back in 2014 that essentially directed statistical agencies to take actions to maintain public trust in government data and statistics. The Evidence Commission actually thought that was such a good idea that it should be codified, that it should be something that is incredibly hard to change because the concepts are so important. And that's exactly what just happened in the Evidence Act. Congress included that provision as part of Title III. And it actually has some implications, I think, that go beyond the statistical community to agency heads across the board. And that's a really promising signal that we now have an incredibly firm statement that says to the extent we're using government data, public trust should always be in the forefront of our minds, which has all sorts of implications for the accountability mechanisms, how we go about providing transparency in terms of what data are used, how they're used, and honestly what the benefits of providing access and accessibility of these data really are. There's a provision that's included in this part of the law that specifically talks about making administrative records accessible by default for agencies that are using this authority. Informally, the Evidence Commission called this yes and less. We often have challenges accessing administrative records across government because a whole host of reasons, one of which is legal interpretations. If there's ambiguity or legal uncertainty, agency lawyers may not view it as a necessity. And in some cases, we have a number of documented instances where data access has really been restricted as a consequence of that. The goal here, by including this presumption of accessibility, is not to just open the doors widely for people to freely access these confidential records, but to ensure that when inside government we start having those important conversations about accessibility in confidential settings, that the direction of the conversation should immediately be why not access as opposed to why access. And that's going to be a really important and new change in the default for many of the conversations we have about data access inside government. Just a couple of other things really briefly to mention that I think are relevant for this audience. There's a new direction under this law that requires the federal government to establish a common portal for researchers who want to access confidential data held by government. So today there are some agencies that do this pretty well, but it's often it's a burden for researchers and not for the agencies to actually articulate how you would go about accessing their data. And so by having a common application portal, it doesn't mean that the decisions are necessarily made about access from a single individual or single entity, but rather it's a common starting point for knowing how to go about getting access to those data. There's been some really productive conversations already underway about how to go about establishing that portal, and I think we'll likely see some announcements from the executive branch in the near future on that one in particular. And the last thing that I'll mention, just briefly in the space of privacy, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking spent a lot of time talking about the new risks of re-identification that happen around information with personal identifiers or business identifiers. And that the risk of re-identification is becoming increasingly challenging to address. And one of the provisions of this law is a really clear statement that says Congress recognizes those risks are evolving. And to the extent possible, we can do a better job of studying those risks before we make public use data files or before we release information publicly. So what this means in practice is that I think you'll see a lot more conversations about managing risk, but also recognizing that this is about risk as opposed to a kind of binary, this is either a definitively anonymized data set or definitively not. I try to never use the term anonymous because it's very often something that we can't achieve in practice. So I think this is a really, yet another really great indication of the direction that we are moving as governments making more and more data available and publicly accessible. All right, so what does this mean for all of you? Just a couple of things that I would tease out here in brief. One, I think when you take the provisions of this new law, the Evidence Act, in their totality, there's really a clear emphasis on reducing the burden for researchers in some cases. I was mentioning the new application process. I described the data inventories that will help identify what data exist. So increasingly recognizing that to the extent we can reduce those burdens, researchers can spend their time doing research rather than focusing on the processes of identifying data at the outset. The improved accessibility of data under the open government provisions and under the statistical authority that I was describing, I think will offer a lot of new opportunities for accessing and potentially linking together data that we haven't previously seen in the past. To the extent we're successful in that front, both in terms of providing access and even doing those linkages, I think it's fairly safe to say that we'll see greater uses of data as a consequence of that. And one thing that we generally say is that the more we're using data, particularly administrative records, we start to identify some of the data quality gaps and issues that might exist in data that we can improve over time. I described the idea of a learning agenda, the strategic plan for research, and I think that's a really interesting opportunity for the research community to have a little bit better knowledge about what the policy relevant questions that are being posed in real time are. And then we can begin to address those. And then finally, I think because of the establishment of the new data officers and the evaluation officers, we'll start to see a little bit of an evolution of the workforce inside federal agencies around those two functions. And it's hard to predict exactly how that will unfold. But I think in some agencies, for example, that don't have a strong culture of evaluation, we'll start to see the workforce emerge that will help support those activities. All right, so what can you all do? Well, there's a lot. I'm just going to throw some ideas on the screen. I won't necessarily talk through all of these. You're of course welcome to scan back on the list after we wrap today. Most importantly here, I want to stress for all of you that I think your continued engagement will be really important, really critical for the success of implementation of this law. One thing in particular to stay attuned to is the emerging federal data strategy. It will be announced in coming weeks by the executive branch. And OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, will be specifically asking for your feedback. and looking for some help on how it's framed and what the specific actions are that are to be undertaken. And the reason I think that is really essential is the strategy is going to closely align with this new law, the Evidence Act. And so it will be one of the primary mechanisms for implementing the provisions that I've just described. So to the extent anything that I've just mentioned in the last 15 minutes or so sounds intriguing for you, I encourage you to pay attention to the federal data strategy and provide feedback to OMB about how they can most effectively implement those provisions. Lots of other ideas here. I'd say, if there are agencies that you care about, work with a lot, or use their data frequently, I would encourage you to contact them, stay in touch with those agencies as they undertake implementation activities. This is going to be a long road. We know some agencies are going to take quite a long time to develop the really thoughtful implementation plans, and that's okay. For this community, it's going to be important that you don't lose sight of the fact that sometimes things don't happen overnight in government, and that's also okay. But what we want to see is that effective implementation is realized, and that we're giving thoughtful attention to the themes that came out of the Evidence Commission, privacy, access, and the core capacity. So let me just stop there and say I'm happy to answer any questions about the substance of the bill or thoughts about how you can stay engaged.
Thank you, Nick. I think it's amazing that he was able to cover the history of this topic and all of the different iterations in such a short period of time, but in a really understandable way. Again, if you'd like to ask questions, you can put them into the chat box, or you can raise your hand on the participants list and we can unmute your line or call on you individually. We do have one question from Ed Lebo from Anthropology, who's COSSA's chair right now, and it reads, Dr. Hart, thanks for an informative presentation. Could you talk a bit about the relationship of the Evidence Act to the Paperwork Reduction Act, which often restricts, in a politicized fashion, federal data collection that are considered overly burdensome, and the Data Quality Act, which imposes certain quality attributes on federal data collection? Wouldn't these have implications for what is considered credible, actionable, policy-relevant evidence?
Yes. So one hidden thing in this new law is a change to how federal agencies will undertake implementing the Paperwork Reduction Act. So this is something I think that is particularly exciting. The way that the PRA requirements are implemented across agencies today, the office that has to approve it before it can get sent over to the Office of Management and Budget is the Chief Information Officer. So if you're not familiar with CIOs, they largely take on the responsibility of managing IT systems, but not always an emphasis on data quality or data stewardship. The core tasks around reviewing PRA requests have now been reassigned to the Chief Data Officers because their core function is going to be about data quality and data management and data stewardship. And so this is not necessarily the perfect answer to your question, or an indication that all problems with the PRA or all challenges in implementation will go away. But what I think it is going to do is force some really productive conversations about what implementation of the Paperwork Reduction Act really looks like across government. This is probably not the time to review the number 10 that triggers the PRA requirements, but in terms of the processes that we set up, people that are participating, the types of questions and activities that they're undertaking in the course of those reviews, I think all of that is going to be on the table as we learn how the new Chief Data Officers are going to be able to undertake the responsibility.
Okay, there are no other questions right now in the chat box, but if anyone has one and they would like to unmute their lines, I will pause for a minute and allow you to do that. And seeing none, before we let you go, we do like to end each conversation with a homework assignment. And Nick was kind enough this time to offer some homework from his perspective, and then we'll end out with what you can do from a COSSA perspective.
So as I mentioned, one thing that I think will be important for this community is to stay attuned to the federal data strategy and the upcoming announcements. You can learn more about what all of that means at strategy.data.gov and also sign up for their email list. Also would strongly encourage all of you to reach out to federal agencies that are handling the priority areas that you work on to do what you can to support implementation of the Evidence Act. And I know COSSA has offered to help, so encourage you to use them as a resource as well.
Thank you. And then, of course, as I said earlier, Advocacy Day is coming up, and we cover a lot of issues on when it comes to Advocacy Day. And we have covered evidence-based policymaking and the legislation in the past. And so we try to keep that activity as current and relevant as possible. And early bird registration ends tomorrow. So I strongly encourage you to register and to join us in April and May. Finally, before we let you go, wanted to end with this slide as we usually do. If you found this information useful, there's lots of things that you can do to help us spread the word. First, you can tune in every month. We are going to continue throughout the year, every second Thursday of the month for the headlines and the deep dive conversations. But in addition, you need to tell your colleagues to sign up for members-only communications and activities like this. Because of our structure, we really have an opt-in process for getting these types of materials and information out to our community. So just because you're on today's webinar doesn't mean that others within your organization, your institution, or your society are getting the notices of events like this. So please do share the word. But also, as I said earlier, if you see groups who you think benefit from this type of engagement and they're not on our member list, we would love it for anyone willing to connect us with those organizations. We're always looking to grow our family, and so welcome your recommendations there. And of course, this is meant to be a two-way communication between COSSA and our members, and so we want to address the topics that interest you most. So please send us your ideas for deep dive conversations for later in the year, and we'd be happy to set those up or even work with some of you on some of these deep dive topics. Finally, save the date. The next headlines will be March 14th. We are hopeful that the deep dive topic will be on the President's 2020 budget request. We will distill for you everything that's in the budget request, what it means for social behavioral science, but more importantly, what it signals for the appropriations process throughout the year, keeping in mind that the budget request is just a budget. It's just a planning document. So we plan to speak more strategically about what we think we can accomplish this year, with the budget request being just one piece of that. And of course, we'll cover next month's headlines as well, so you know what you need to know when you need to know it. A reminder, if you missed last month's headlines, the video recording should be available on our website now. And tomorrow you should be receiving an email with the recording from today's headlines, and feel free to share those materials as well. Seeing no other questions or hands raised, we will give you back a little bit of your time. Feel free to contact me or anyone else from the COSSA team with any questions, comments, or ideas. We welcome your input. And I hope you all have a great Valentine's Day, and we will talk to you next month.